Welcome to IFES' Dialogues on Democracy. I'm Editorial and Communications Manager Adam Gallagher, and today I'm speaking with Vasu Mohan, IFES' Regional Director for the Asia Pacific and Technical Lead for Elections, Conflict, and Security, about his new IFES white paper, Countering Hate Speech in Elections, Strategies for Electoral Management Bodies. Hate speech has played a prominent role in elections around the globe in recent years, amplified by the proliferation of social media. For responsible electoral institutions, the problem is dynamic and complex. Remedies involving restrictions on free speech and on political and electoral rights are controversial, as they may limit fundamental rights in a democratic society. Indeed, some human rights activists and international institutions have insisted that the best response to hate speech is more speech. Vasu and I discuss what led him and senior election specialist Catherine Barnes to write this paper, how it's been used, what is special about hate speech in elections, and how it is often used against women, and the role of traditional media. Hi, Vasu. Thanks for joining us today to talk about your new IFES white paper. To start off, can you just tell us a little bit about why you wrote the paper and kind of explain exactly what hate speech is, what it means?
Nice to be here, Adam, and have this conversation. Hate speech is speech that incites hatred towards individuals or groups based on race, religion, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, disability, or other traits. Now, hate speech is becoming more widespread phenomenon globally, and particularly during the election campaigns, and election commissions and civil society, with whom IFES works around the world, are finding it very difficult to address this in an effective manner. So last year, when we were working with electoral bodies and other institutions in Kenya and in Sri Lanka, we found that these institutions were struggling, but they were also asking us as an international organization providing technical assistance to help them. So this paper really came out of a request from these institutions on how to effectively address hate speech during elections.
Okay. So, can you give us some concrete examples of how hate speech is used?
So hate speech, in election campaigns are used mostly, the majority of times, by politicians, and they use it as a way to get more votes. It's a very calculated and it's a very strategic move on their part to exploit pre-existing differences or prejudices or hatreds to their own advantage. So whereas traditionally this happened in campaign rallies and locations, now it is spread to social media, and the anonymity that social media often provides and the widespread nature of how it is accessed, the different tools, the different platforms, and which are mostly unregulated space, that exacerbates the impact of hate speech. So recently, the election management bodies in Indonesia, the Election Commission and the Election Supervisory Body, the Executive Office of the President, the Ministry of Home Affairs, and other civil society groups came together in a roundtable where they had invited IFES to present this white paper and to share with them what are some global strategies or good practices on addressing hate speech. And we shared with them sort of the key points in the paper, which are that there isn't a universal definition, but there is consensus that any form of speech that rejects core human rights principles and principles of human dignity and equality is really hate speech. And as electoral management bodies and government, they have a responsibility to address that. And we also talked about different ways of doing this. There are regulatory responses where you would pass laws and regulations on how to combat hate speech. And there are non-regulatory responses where institutions can come together, work as an alliance, work as a coalition to address this from various standpoints. And these non-regulatory examples tend to be more effective. The legal framework is important, but I think in terms of creating change, because judicial processes may be slower, there may be issues relating to definitions and the law not being specific enough or clear enough, and who has the authority. There are more barriers to regulatory responses, whereas non-regulatory responses could be more effective. So having this conversation in Indonesia was very useful for the stakeholders.
Okay, great. So we're actually sitting down to record this on International Women's Day. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how hate speech is used against women specifically.
So one of the points that this paper makes, because there are different definitions and not all definitions cover sex and gender and sexual orientation or gender identity as a protected class, we make the point that from IFES's perspective, and there's growing consensus on this, that any speech directed towards women that is, makes it harder for women to run for office, makes it more insecure for women to run for office, and sort of attacks the dignity of the individual, either as an election worker, as a candidate, or a voter, or any person engaged in the electoral process. That is clearly hate speech. And what we are seeing are ways in which women who are running for office and women who are in positions of authority are attacked, particularly on social media. And the language is very vile and very vulgar. And the sort of biggest concern that their families, their children, begin urging them not to participate in this. So there's obviously the threat, but there is also family and social pressure, and it creates an environment of insecurity for other women to take on these leadership positions. So this is a clear issue, and something that both the paper but also the other streams of knowledge and tools that IFES have developed on addressing violence against women in elections can and will address.
Sure. So can you talk a little bit about what the role of traditional media is in regard to hate speech, particularly when we're getting closer to an election day?
Recently, we were invited to Fiji by the Fijian Electoral Office and the Media Supervisory Authority, and they had brought together journalists from Fiji to talk about how to accurately report on elections, but also do it in a way that is sensitive of hate speech in the electoral campaign. So the key issue with media from that conversation and other conversations that we have held seems to be that they, on the one hand, they want to report what happened accurately, and hate speech, if it is used by a politician, is newsworthy. But they need to do that in a way that it doesn't amplify the hate speech that is already occurring. So this is and it's new space for them, because often the hate speech occurs in social media or it occurs in large campaigns, and they are struggling with how to report it, even just to let the public know that this was used, but also how to do it without giving it more airtime, and that seems to be the key struggle with journalists.
All right, finally, Vasu, before we close today, I was wondering if you could just give us some examples or talk a little bit about some of the resources that are provided in the paper.
So the paper looks at how hate speech has been addressed in legal frameworks in many countries. It gives concrete examples. So if you were writing regulations or law, you can look at a variety of resources, and it gives links to those resources. It also gives a list of organizations and materials that have been produced to address hate speech, particularly in the context of electoral campaigns. So there's an extensive list of resources at the end of the paper and a collection of good practices.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for joining us today to talk about the paper. You've given us a lot of reasons to check it out in a more in-depth way, and it's something that's a really timely topic now, so we appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, Adam.
For more on how IFES promotes democracy around the world, please visit www.ifes.org.